Hello there, I'm David, this is Kat, we're both from Groundsures. We're going to be talking to you today around ESG and specifically the environmental risks related in the E of ESG. So Kat, there's been a lot of talk particularly around ESG and property transactions specifically. Do you think that solicitors do owe their clients a duty of care when it comes to climate risks?
Definitely. So back in July 2022, we commissioned a legal opinion from Stephen Troman's KC, and he essentially concluded that lawyers do owe a duty of care to warn and advise their clients about climate risk. But I think there's been a lot prior to the publication of that legal opinion, particularly from other lawyers, other people in the industry, particularly with the Law Society resolution and obviously COP26. Would you like to add a bit more to that?
Yeah, I think the point of the resolution when it came out in 2021, a lot of that was focused around the idea that solicitors should actually start to arm themselves with better information, particularly around education and training teams and being aware of the potential implications that there were. So that's what struck me as I think as an important first step in what the Law Society did, and it sort of paved the way after that, I think. There were a couple of commentators that you were pointing to that highlighted that there clearly were evident environmental, there were risks in relation to not providing guidance. I think Sarah DeGay from UCL, she was a visiting professor, that came out very clearly that there was a resounding answer was, they should take this into account. And the former Supreme Justice, I think Lord Cornworth, also said that it was very important, I think, that solicitors, conveyancers should very much take into account issues related to climate risk when they're advising clients and assessing the transaction.
I think there's some really good points there. We can't also forget that back in 2020, the Chancery Lane project released the first phase of their climate clauses, which were designed for conveyancers and real estate lawyers to be used in the absence of climate searches. Obviously, things have moved on since then, but they were a valuable resource kind of going back, a good 3 years.
So Kat, what's the importance of solicitors providing this climate-related advice to clients then?
I think first and foremost, it's around having certainty on the asset that you are purchasing, particularly in more vulnerable areas like on the coast, those are at risk of flooding. Clients want information at their fingertips. They want to know that their asset is going to be protected. Probably around 95% of transactions, risks aren't going to be identified, but they also want to know that. They don't necessarily just need to know about the negatives. I think there's also a point from a lender and insurance perspective. The banks, they've done all of their stress testing. Climate change was a key consideration for that, particularly from subsidence and from flood risk. And also from an insurer's perspective, they have access to a whole range of data that doesn't just look at the insurance risk now, but also in the future. And it's about them protecting their back book as much as people acquiring new property.
So that's really important with regard to the physical risks that climate is impacting on property transactions, for example. But I think there's an added, often increasingly important dimension for the lenders as well now, related to the energy efficiency of properties and the impact of the cost of retrofitting, I think, some of those properties. And whether there could be a risk that lenders could be left with an asset that costs too much, that the owner doesn't want to invest the money in. So I think there's an awful lot of elements of that around, is there an element in the negotiation that there's a cost to retrofit? Therefore, is there a price chipping exercise there that's done in the transaction? Or actually, is it important to think about not only to save energy costs of this time where money's tight, but also could that actually improve on the value of the property, I think, as well, related to other properties in the area? Is this something that's saleable?
Yeah, definitely. I think as well from a law firm's perspective, by adding in climate advice, it gives them a bit of a competitive advantage. It kind of shows that they're going the extra mile for their clients, but in a very controlled way, I suppose. Like, they're not doing it for the sake of it. They're just making sure everything is protected. So what about compliance in this area?
Well, I think it's an important dimension that increasingly COLPs are looking at environmental risks and the issue of whether it's consistent in a practice. There's increasingly more training that's now available. And I think it's important for Colps to seize this, because the SRA are now very clearly making this an important part of their future focus on the risk register. So that consistency of approach by fee earners and teams to make sure that they're doing the same thing and following the same policy really helps reinforce the ESG management as well as a policy across the firm, and engages Colps and senior partners to make sure that conveyancing teams are working properly.
So the Law Society released its guidance on climate change to solicitors earlier this year, and we're expecting some real estate specific guidance coming out in the future. How does this affect everyday practice?
Well, actually, I think nothing really should change. The important thing is that for the last 20 years or so, conveyancers, commercial property lawyers have been doing due diligence for flood, contaminated land, ground stability, and have been using those reports as part of signposting those risks. So we view very much, and I think the market increasingly is, that climate change information is the same sort of information but looking forward in time. So rather than looking current or in the past, it's projecting ahead using the same sort of reliance that have been in these reports for many years. So for that simple reason alone, I think nothing should really change in terms of policy and practice here. The important thing, as I said, I think earlier, is about the consistency across the teams to make sure that they're doing the same thing all the time. Another impact for firms, I think, is the threat and the risk of greenwashing. I mean, that really is a very serious situation where a firm that may assert themselves as having ESG credentials, say for example a large city commercial firm that puts itself out there as has a strong ESG practice, but then potentially advises a carbon intensive client, there's a risk that they could fall foul of greenwashing, to the likes of which that Client Earth, for example, were trying to pursue BP and Shell and others for that exact situation. So I think a question that's on everyone's minds is, how are solicitors, conveyancers expected to communicate climate risks to clients then?
So there's a number of matters that are related to the conveyancing transaction, and solicitors are not necessarily qualified or are experts in quite a few of these areas. So if we look at tax or AML, that kind of thing. So that's why tools have been developed to make sure that they can undertake their due diligence, but it also protects their client and their firm's interests. So what we've done with Climate Index is we've included it in our searches as standard. And this means that lawyers don't have to think about anything unnecessary or anything that is an additional cost to them or to their client. And this, combined with the climate clauses that we've developed, but also clauses that, like the Chancery Lane project, have developed, means that they can effectively report the results of the search to their client without having to do any interpretation of the data. It's just a very, very streamlined process that they can just take the search, pass it on to their client with little or no interpretation needed. So David, are there any notable cases or examples of climate impacting on the legal profession?
Yeah, so I mentioned Client Earth earlier and their activities, and they became very active in around 2020, and they targeted the marketing campaign by BP that was focusing around the issues of making energy cleaner, and obviously that pointed towards the work they were doing around their renewable energy exploration. But they took the complaint. The OECD effectively found that Client Earth had legitimate grounds for complaint on that. And BP subsequently then withdrew the advert because the balance of the business clearly was still in favour of the petrochemical operations. And in 2023, Client Earth brought another case, this time against Shell. They were actually shareholders in the company, and they brought other significant investors in with them to complain that the board had not done enough against their prior Paris commitments on helping to reduce their environmental impact. That case went to court, it went to the High Court, it was subsequently went through a number of processes, but was ultimately thrown out. But it did send a clear marker, I think, to other in-house counsel in significant carbon major firms that Client Earth would be coming after them, and it would open up firms or firms that operated for those kind of carbon intensive industries that they could be exposed to significant ESG litigation risks in the future. So, Kat, we've seen clients make serious demands of law firms in the areas of equality and diversity. Are you seeing, or is your sense that there could be significant equal demands in the ESG space going forward?
I think so, yes. I think, we've talked about greenwashing quite a lot. The bar is set a lot higher for commercial law firms. Their clients put greater expectations upon them. For residential conveyances, it's just kind of about doing the same thing. You just walk the walk. You still report on environmental risks like they have been doing for years. It's just being projected into the future. And whilst there's no real examples of conveyancer litigation yet, we have seen examples historically, particularly Bird and Bird, where information has been contained within a report. They failed to pass that on to their client, and it has resulted in quite a big lawsuit. So yeah, it's really just about that, I think. Thanks for that. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. And really just to summarise for everybody, there is a duty of care that solicitors have. It could be higher for more commercial law firms, but we don't want to overcomplicate this. There's tools available to make sure that they're ticking their due diligence box. We've developed climate clauses and other resources that are available on our website at the touch of people's fingertips. And really, it's just about doing what they've always been doing, I think, from a due diligence and environmental perspective.
Yeah, I agree. I think it may seem very daunting, the whole concept of climate and what can I do about climate, but we all have a role to play. And I think, yeah, you're right. If conveyancers can stay in their lane, for example, and give advice that's within strict bounds, then I think that's absolutely fair. And actually, while it might seem a complex subject, the processes are relatively simple and straightforward. So hopefully we've given everybody some clear direction on this and have some interesting insight. And thank you.
Great, thank you.